Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you had a wonderful day so far and very interesting discussions. And it's a great pleasure for me to host the next discussion. It's on internet censorship. Censorship, I guess, for most of you is not new. China, Iran, they have implemented it right from the beginning. They have been censoring the information space for years now. But I think the challenge has become bigger because autocratic regimes have developed digital dictatorships. They attack and undermine democracies, elections through disinformation, propaganda, and cyber attacks. And I think the whole day you have heard these phrases and terms. But it's only one side of the same coin. At the same time, these digital dictatorships suppress the free flow of information within their own states through internet censorship. And so they monopolize their information space at home with their propaganda narratives. And as a result, the affected populations live in a parallel world due to the censored information. So the whole concept of free exchange of information worldwide and the whole concept of a global dialogue, a diverse dialogue, is under threat, as you can see in our clip for this session.
Sometimes news, sometimes information is more important for human survival than even food.
Propaganda, disinformation, censorship. Autocratic rule has almost gained complete control over narratives in some regions already. How can proponents of freedom of information counter this development? How can Western democratic societies find a balance between digital self-defense while safeguarding the fundamental freedom of information? Let's talk about it. Defending free access to online information under authoritarian rule.
So, I hope you have now the feeling of an interesting debate and interesting discussion. But I think we are even more privileged to have a wonderful lineup of speakers and decision makers here with us today. And so I would first like to introduce Mrs. Besancenot. She is Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy of NATO. Give her a welcome. Next, we have Mrs. Nicolai. She is Deputy Director General of EU DG cen-sorship, which is the Directorate General Communications, Networks, Content, and Technology. Please. Yeah, please. Yeah. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Gershenzon. He is founder and head of True Story and a Russian tech entrepreneur for the last 20 years. Thank you very much. And finally, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Limburg. As you all know, he is Director General of Deutsche Welle, but he's also member of DG8, which is a group of leading Western international public broadcasters. So, before we get started, I would like to point you as the audience to our quiz. Please check your iPhones and take part in this quiz because we would like to have your input on the question how you think, because we are here solution-orientated, how you think we can find together solutions to circumvent censorship. But now let's jump right into the discussion. Mrs. Nicolai, as the EU faces the question of disinformation and propaganda on its own soil, perhaps and as I said, we have to see this as a combination. But how do you view the challenge of internet censorship in authoritarian regimes in general, and of course in Russia?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, because it's really an interesting forum also to share with you from the EU side first impressions on what has been an interesting stress test of our recent platform rules, which we have adopted, the Digital Services Act, which are fully content agnostic and which respect the freedom of speech, but nevertheless are useful tools to tidy up the system when you are faced with disinformation campaigns. And of course, we just had a feast of democracy with the European Parliament elections. And so, of course, we use these rules and this kind of ecosystem that we have created quite well in the last couple of months to see how we can better equip ourselves. And it has been a really interesting journey, a combination of much more coordinated action at the EU level between, on the one hand, using the tools vis-à-vis the platforms to really push them, either because we could use the Digital Services Act to open investigations, but also to give them more guidance in order to increase the due diligence, especially in election times, to protect the election integrity, for instance, by watermarking and labeling deepfakes, which a lot of them followed, which will be also the future law under our AI Act, but also to kind of use the system that we have created with the self-regulatory system of the Code of Practice Against Disinformation, which we had for a couple of years, the fact-checkers organizations that we have created to really alert on a daily basis disinformation waves so that they could be flagged and immediately being reacted upon. And the third part was really also a much better awareness in the general public about disinformation. If you compare that to 5 years ago, the last European Parliament election, we were not at the same level. So, you know, we are looking at the details now. We will analyze that, but overall, we could see that we could really, with that kind of coordinated action and all the tools working in best harmony, we could tame the disinformation reach. It was there, but we could kind of tame that it would stay viral, that it would really have the disruptive effects in a big way. But of course, there are many concerns around us. I mean, we are faced with propaganda from certain, regimes around us, and we are faced with, the limited access to, free information in countries such as Russia. And that's why, as much as we try to protect our own information space with the new rules, also with media kind of policy in a much more joined-up way, we try to protect the Russian population and support access to free information there by supporting exiled journalists, by, of course, supporting also access to VPN sources and all these kind of things. And I think that will remain even more important. We have to showcase how we do it in Europe. We have to be credible as actors in really defending, our information space, and we have issues ourselves. I mean, we saw it in the clip. We also have, some kind of, limitations of media pluralism and media freedom in our own member states that we need to address. And we will, with the European Media Freedom Act, have a better tool in our hands to address that in the future. But we also have to make sure we use in the best way our cooperation with journalists around the world to support them in their safety efforts and to have intelligent programs and initiatives to support access to free information.
Thank you. Mrs. Besancenot, how do you view, how does NATO, not you, view Russia's use of internet censorship? Because how does it affect your public diplomacy initiatives if you want to talk to the Russian audience?
Thank you. Thank you for asking the questions. Indeed, outreach is a NATO priority, of course, to reassure our own audiences, our own allies, the 1 billion citizens that we protect, but also making sure that audiences elsewhere understand NATO's purpose, NATO's mission, a defensive alliance, preserving peace, and preventing conflict, and that the audiences that we try to reach are not, don't get misperceptions even before we get to reach them. Regarding Russian audiences, maybe one thing I should say is that there was a NATO-Russia council with diplomatic channels open, discussions happening at a very institutional level, which of course has been completely damaged since the full-fledged invasion. Since then, of course, we need, and also we had, NATO had an office in Moscow with someone engaging with Russian mainstream media, talking and TV shows, really explaining NATO's mission to Russian audiences. This we don't have anymore, unfortunately, so this forces us indeed to think about indirect approaches. So how do we do this? First of all, we do have our own social media in Russian. That's a great effort that we're making. We actually duplicate every external comms in English. We actually also do in Russian, on Telegram, on Instagram, on YouTube, Facebook, and so on. We're learning to do more and more content in Russian natively, not only translated from English, which is a bit of a challenge. The second thing that we do is work, and indeed Renata was saying, indirectly with journalists in exile, supporting what they're doing, giving them access to what NATO is, opening the doors and giving them access to NATO experts so that they can reach the audiences they are still in touch with, which we cannot touch directly. And maybe the last thing, which is very NATO specific, very military, is of course what's happening on the military side of the house with all the NATO exercises that are conducted with all the allies. The first goal is of course to train together, to be interoperable, but the second goal is also to signal something. It's part of the deterrence posture. And then we see this appears indeed in the Russian mainstream media, and they do pick up on those exercises, so and often factually, sometimes it's mispresented, sometimes it's just factual, so we do still have those three channels to reach the Russian audiences.
Okay, thank you. That means you both try to reach out to the audiences. But as I said, the internet censorship, a lot of websites are blocked. I guess your website is blocked, or at least the Twitter profiles and so on are all blocked because of Twitter, or X as we call it now, is blocked in Russia. Facebook is blocked, Instagram is blocked. And that's why I want to ask Lev Gershenzon, what happened, what did you see on the Russian most famous news aggregator Yandex News in February 2022?
Yeah, just after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I visited the website where I used to work for more than 7 years, and I was in charge of the news aggregator news service. And Yandex is one of few portals, really famous portals in the world, where a full automatic news section was on the main page. And it's important to understand because, well, the audience, the daily audience of this portal exceeds, well, it's like tens of millions of people daily, and in the very first days of the invasion, these numbers, they grew significantly, and they reached 100 million people daily, and it's very understandable because, well, when something really important happens, people that are ordinarily not that interested in news, they turn from TV that is fully governmentally regulated to internet, which was supposed to be a free space, and they saw what I saw, that they saw no information about the bombings and shellings of the cities. They saw and read no mentions of the war happening. Actually, it was about a special war operation. It's like the government is still giving the name of what's happening, this full-scale invasion and war. And yeah, well, the influence of Yandex is hard to overestimate because, well, it's a portal, it provides a lot of services, and people really rely on Yandex in general, on Yandex e-commerce, on Yandex Taxi, on Yandex Shopping, well, all that stuff. And so that's why a lot of people, so-called ordinary people that are not working with information daily, they're so vulnerable to this misinformation or disinformation because, well, they receive it from a source that they normally rely on. Yeah, and this is exactly the case that we have and we see even major, really big tech players worldwide, companies like Google that are in charge of providing billions of people like worldwide with information, with news information, with all kinds of information and not just information. And when they are being manipulated or used by bad actors, it's really not just a threat, it's a real big problem, so I stop.
Yeah, Lev, thank you. I think we will go into this deeper because this is one of the main questions, how Western big tech companies actually help to misinform or disinform Russian public in Russia. But that's perhaps for the second part for solutions. So I would like to bring in Peter Limburg. DW is very well respected in Russia, and what happened to our audience when the full-scale invasion came, and we were even right before we were forbidden in Russia. So how did we react how did DW react to this?
Well, DW reacted already 2014 when the war began in Ukraine, and we should not forget that this annexation of Crimea and the actions in the eastern part were already a war. And after this immediate war, the war on information started, and with all the disinformation. So we started a bureau in Kiev, and we intensified our reporting out of Russia, out of Ukraine, and hired more people, and so more people could report. Then we had been accused of whatever conspiracy theories, and we had to leave Russia, and we had been kicked out 3 weeks before the war started. So the full-scale invasion in 22 started. We had to leave the country. And also our reporters have to leave, and so they had to go in exile. Either they're here or they are now in a bureau in Moscow. Not in Moscow. They wish to be in Moscow, but they are in a bureau in Riga. So this is what we're doing, and we intensify reporting. But we see that our website is blocked. We see that we cannot use all the social media, which we would like to. We are still on YouTube and on Telegram, but who knows how long this is going to be possible. And so my concern is that on the long run, if we don't find technical solutions to spread the content of international media with a democratic constitution, that it will be very hard to win the hearts and minds of the Russian people, because then they are so much isolated. So you have some kind of a North Korean scenario, where you have only one media, or multiple medias, but with one message, and we could on the long run not enter with our messages and our information. And this is also for people who are active in these countries for democracy. If we leave them alone, then this is something very severe. They might lose faith, they might lose their optimism. And I think we have the obligation not only to create content, but also to make sure that it comes to the users. And we don't have shortwave anymore. It will not come back. It is there somewhere. We could start it, but nobody would be listening. So we have to think of new technical solutions for this problem.
Mrs. Nikolai, so what is your approach to reach out to the public in Russia?
I think it has to be a multifaceted approach. I think there's an important aspect that was just made about being on top of the technological developments. Because, of course, as much as, let's say, the autocrats in the world are kind of abusing technology, to misinform, to kind of, have troll firms, and come with their solutions, we, I think, need to find ways to still break through shutdowns of, internets or, blocking of access to information. So I think that's an important work. This is part of the technological race that we are in this kind of digital revolution that we are living. And then I think that we have to really develop from what I think we tried to develop much more in the last couple of years, which is a media policy that looks at the various aspects in the EU to kind of translate that into our external action. And I think this is, on the one hand, the sustained support for the rights defenders. So I think that's an important aspect of our work, has always been part of our human rights and defense of democracy work. I think it is the kind of, intelligent ways of supporting exiled journalists. It's also using the multilateral fora in a better way. We are at an interesting time where the design for the future of the internet will be developed further in the context of the UN, in the context of the big kind of events happening in the course of the next couple of months. And I think we have to be very wise as international actors, for instance, to ensure that we keep the multi-stakeholder forum aspect on, how we want to govern the internet. Because if we let that go and we leave that space to, let's say, actors such as China or Russia to kind of, take over with a very different version of how they see the information space and how it should be governed, I think that would be the end of really having that multi-stakeholder process that I think has served us overall well. And I'm saying that despite the fact that my daily work is a lot about taming platforms in kind of, how they are abusing some of the issues and how they are not tidying up the system as such. But I think the source of a free internet and the freedom of speech there is that we don't give it in the hands of, certain autocratic leaders. So that's what I mean with the multifaceted approach. I think we also should allow ourselves in the European Union to have a more strategic debate about how we support media. I think it has been a bit too much of a piecemeal approach, but this is something that we will have to discuss in the next mandate of the European Commission, when we will also engage with partners in the other institutions about our multi-annual framework, financial framework, to maybe also specify there a bit more, how we want to kind of engage in media policy support in the context of today's challenges.
I would like to go into the question of abusive. As you said, big tech is abusive, has abusive sides. And Lev Gershenzon, perhaps you could now tell a little bit more about what you meant by Google is helping or manipulating it, the information space.
Yeah, well, involuntarily, of course, but still, it's important to realize that Google Search and Google Chrome, the most popular browser, one of the most popular browsers in Russia, and the recommendation system that's working on mobile devices, Google Discover, they are operating freely in Russia, and the audience is very big. It's maybe the biggest, and they exceed Yandex in some services, and there are tens of millions clicks made daily through Google Discover service, and among these recommendations, and there are a lot of media and news recommendations, they're mostly governmentally approved websites, I would say, containing pure propaganda or to 90–80% extent some so-called neutral content. But this content is totally replacing the relevant news and events and all this independent media which we have in Russia, and which, well, there are some tens of different independent news outlets. They are totally invisible or almost invisible in Russia. Yeah? So the blockings are very effective. These blockings work. All this media, they lost at least 80% of their pre-war audience. And these big tech companies, they are not just being abused or used by the government, because, well, the Russian government invests a lot of resources in faking popularity of some desired messages, and at the same time faking unpopularity or technical unavailability of this independent media. But at the same time, they could be the solution. They could be this silver bullet, just because, well, they have access. Once again, Google, more than 85% of all smartphones in Russia, they operate on an Android operation system, and that means that all these devices, that Google has access to all these devices, and could, if, well, found it interesting, or we were persuasive enough to persuade them to help or to cooperate. So this could be a game changer.
Yes, but the sanctions have reduced the opportunity to make money in Russia for these big tech companies. So they are not interested anymore in this market, but still they are very influential. And so, Mrs. Nikolai, what do you think? How How could you incentivize these companies or regulate them so that at least the advantages for the Kremlin are gone on these websites?
Well, let me be clear from the start. We don't have extraterritorial power to regulate in the EU. So we can set the kind of, space for our information space right. And that's what we have done with, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. And that has an impact on the business models of the platforms. We already see that. Also on kind of, search kind of, engines like Google search, because, we have issues under the Digital Markets Act about self-preferencing. So, and we hope that, with our regulatory actions with regard to the gatekeepers under the Digital Markets Act or the very large online platforms under the Digital Services Act, we can kind of, change their behavior, maybe also at a global scale, in the sense that, if they adjust the systems for the EU, which is an important market for them, why not adjusting it immediately for the global scale? We've done that in the past when we did, for instance, the data protection reform, where also we didn't have any extraterritorial power with it. But, the Googles, the Metas, and the like, when kind of, trying to become GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, compliant, they immediately had a global compliance strategy. So that is one kind of, impact. And the other thing that I would say is that we all have an interest in kind of, pushing also in international fora. That's why I think the multi-stakeholder aspect is so important, where they are part of as well, to really make sure that the principles that we stand for are kind of, reflected also by the big platforms. I think they are under a difficult situation though as well, because do we want Google to also stop acting there, because Deutsche Welle is also using, YouTube to kind of still be there, so that's a difficult kind of judgment call to make. But, I would hope that, the EU stands for a certain approach on digital rights and principles. We have that declaration that we did together with the European Parliament, the European Commission, the European Council of Ministers. We try to reflect that in our work in the UN, in the work on the future of the internet. That's the kind of, soft but determined power that we can have in kind of guiding that future debate. But we cannot regulate what Google does in Russia. We are not extraterritorial.
Mrs. Besanceno, you're representing the hard power, but also in your role as Assistant Director General for Public Diplomacy, you're representing soft power. So what do you think? Do you have a position on big tech companies, not perhaps on extraterritorial legitimization, but do you talk to them? We are in a confrontation with Russia.
Right. Well, first, I would really like to echo what I've just heard. The work that we do in our interactions with those Russian journalists in exile, they tell us two things. First of all, indeed, they cannot make any money out of their content anymore because it's been demonetized, and that's difficult, and they don't know how to survive with this in the long run. And also, the other one is how can you keep reaching people inside Russia? So we hear the same thing from them. So what do we do? NATO has a very long-standing history of a whole-of-society approach, and also reaching out to journalists, simply because NATO is a ministerial every other month. So that means that we have journalists from all over the world coming every other month, and we proactively reach out to independent Russian journalists so that they can also come cover the events and know exactly what this is about. We also, as you're saying, think about technology, what could be the answer? So we do talk to the platforms, and we rely immensely on the work that is being done, of course, on the EU side. We do flag cases, we do flag our own concerns, and we do share the concerns that the journalists in exile are sharing with us, that we can do. And then we can invest in technology, and indeed, in the past 2 years, 18 months, NATO has created a defense innovation accelerator dedicated precisely to dual-use technologies based in the UK with 1 billion euros affected to it via a big innovation fund that was created. And so this would be typically, this information technology, typically the kind of thing that we would be interested in.
Mr. Limburg, I mentioned the DG8 and your part for I think a decade now that you are talking to the other Director Generals. And if we are not talking about big tech companies who want to make money, there's the Open Technology Fund by the US AGM. Could you tell a little bit more about how DW is working together with Open OTF and why OTF is so important?
Yeah, DG8 is an informal group of media, international media. You have the BBC, Voice of America, France Media Monde, Australia, Switzerland, Canada in it, and us, Germany. So we exchange our views and see how the industry is going and see safety of journalism, but also this big question: how do we keep the internet open for our messages? And the US side has created quite a long time ago the OTF, and I think it's stocked by about $40 million a year, and that's their main work, is to invest in VPN, invest in technologies like Siphon, invest in research, how to keep this internet open. They're doing a lot of work also around China. China is a very difficult case, as we all know. But still, it is. I think they're quite successful in what they're doing, and it's not the question how much money you invest. It's the question whether you understood the problem, and the problem is really relevant for us all. And it's also about that. It's not only Russia. Look around your countries, and there are a lot of countries where press freedom is not wanted. There are a lot of countries where journalists and activists are under threat, under pressure. So if the technology, what China brings to the world, and Russia takes, and Belarus takes, and Iran takes, if this technology gets better and better, then you can just count the days and months when this technology comes to your country. So I just can say, beware of this, because we have to be now active and think of how can we keep information flowing. Otherwise we're going to be in big trouble. And it's not only about Western things, it's about freedom. It's about freedom of speech. It's about your personal freedom in your countries. So I think it's not just something which is something for international media. It's something which has to concern all of us. So OTF is a good start, but I think the societies who are interested in freedom of expression and democracy, they have to invest in technologies. Like Elon Musk invested in Starlink. Starlink is not the answer, because you can find the stuff which is on the ground. So, but we have to think, and I think there are a lot of smart people around the world, and maybe if they start to get interested in this, this can help.
Thank you. Mrs. Besorsino, you mentioned, I think, grants you are giving to journalists. Are you giving grants to tech entrepreneurs as well?
That would be more the role of this accelerator that I mentioned, but the grants go to civil society, definitely. And maybe just to draw on what Peter just said, I think we have really increased our ability to track disinformation. We have invested in those tools, and I think we can say we're collectively where we want to be, I think. And indeed, I would really echo what you're saying, that the next step, I think, where we are now is indeed this cooperation to have a momentum as strong there around creating information integrity for all of us to benefit from, as strong as what we have achieved on coming to grips with that specific object, which is disinfo, and which the EU has done very well, but of course it's also a transatlantic exercise. We worked a lot with the Americans doing that, explaining it's not about content, it's also about tactics, and I think now the same effort needs to happen to preserve that integrity.
Mrs. Nicolai, is the EU thinking about such a kind accelerator?
Well, I think de facto we're already trying that a little bit by kind of, living the whole society approach ourselves. So, I mean, if you really want to be on top of disinformation and addressing it in a meaningful way, you have to work on, really increasing your detection capacity. So that's, I think, what we've all kind of invested in heavily. Regardless of whether the disinformation sources come from foreign actors or whether they are maybe foreign actors motivated, but they are repeated by domestic proxies, because that's what we also observe. Also identifying always the next waves of disinformation. I mean, there are narratives that are very well known in the EU, but that changes because it's depending on externalities. And what is also interesting from our kind of, experience in working on disinformation is that you really have to go relatively deep, because we might now talk a lot about the EU, but actually, when you really want to address disinformation in a meaningful way, you need to go much deeper and identify that, in certain regions, certain disinformation waves work and are really kind of targeted. In other regions, it's not the same, so even within the EU. So that's an important part. Then, of course, really holding accountable the main channels. That's the work we do on platforms, and that can be done also internationally just by calling on their responsibility, even if we cannot see very soon an international treaty like the DSA becoming global. And then the third area is really to kind of constantly work on the targets. So the society, so to really have awareness campaigns and talk about this information so that people are more aware that this is a real challenge. And I think that is a huge kind of game changer also when I compare where we were now in the EU compared to 5 years ago. I mean, all the kind of information campaigns that we have done on simply, content agnostic, just informing that there might be disinformation, I think had an important effect. So I think that's what we can showcase. And as I said, I think we should try to translate that, especially also in our programs and our external action, also with regard to our relationship with partners.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm already getting the sign that we unfortunately have to end the discussion. I think we would like to see the results of the quiz. How do you reach audiences when autocrats try to stop you? I think there are some things like use VPN, but as you know, a lot of autocratic regimes can now stop VPN as well. So it's a technological arms race in the information space. And I hope that perhaps we will check this and you will have a look at it, and perhaps you can develop other ideas and for your accelerator. So thank you very much for this discussion. I think we have to continue this discussion at the next Global Media Forum as well. So because it's an ongoing debate how to circumvent internet censorship. Thank you very much for your interest. Give a warm welcome to all the panelists. Thank you very much.